So, now we are going to talk about biodiversity and the role of seeds in the agricultural system. First of all, let me start with one of your most important publications, Shattering Food, Politics and the Loss of Genetic Diversity. It is widely regarded as the most comprehensive guide on topic of biodiversity. Could you explain what is biodiversity and why it is so important for our planet to protect the genetic diversity of plants?
Sure. I mean, first of all, it's a bit depressing if it's still that widely regarded because it was published back in 1990, and a lot more has happened in the world since then. So it's a bit disappointing if it hasn't been better materials. I think there have been better materials produced since then. I mean, to us, we cannot survive climate change or other changes in our climate and biodiversity unless we have access to a much wider diversity of both species and varieties of both livestock and plants. There's just no way that we're going to be able to meet the rapid changes ahead of us. So we have to have access to that biodiversity. The tragedy is, perhaps the most terrifying figure I know, is that 45% of all private sector research in agriculture is focused on just one crop, maize. And that is a recipe for disaster. Perhaps we can almost be happy that some of the companies aren't looking at other crops, but it shows a narrowness of focus in agriculture, which is really quite terrifying. So we need to somehow access the enormous diversity that peasants have access to around the world in again, not just in plants, although the plants are the primary concern, but also in livestock, also in fish species, also in uncultivated species.
Okay, but there are historic episodes that demonstrate that the lack of biodiversity is dangerous for agricultural crops.
Yes, many. Going back to my origins, I'm a Canadian, but my ancestry is Irish, and the Irish potato famine, of course, in the 1840s, 1850s, was because of the genetic base of potatoes in Ireland. It was extremely narrow, and the entire crop was destroyed by a single disease, and that led to 1 million Irish people dying, and about 2 million more eventually leaving Ireland to find homes in places like Canada. Again, I'm a refugee of the famine that was created by the loss of genetic diversity in Ireland. But there are many other cases, whether we're talking about coffee in Sri Lanka, we're talking about corn in the United States, maize in the United States in the 1970s, or many other diseases at different times have been. We've had a wipeout of a crop because of the narrowness of this genetic base.
Okay, I understand. So, say that what's, in your opinion, the state of biodiversity around the world? What are the countries which are registering the major loss of biodiversity, and why?
Well, the greatest loss, of course, is taking place in Europe and North America, where we've had industrial agriculture for the longest period of time, and there's very little left of the diversity that we once had. And of course, in North America, we really never had very much diversity in our food systems since the arrival of Europeans in North America. We lost both the indigenous peoples and the indigenous agriculture at that time. So we're down to a very narrow genetic base for our food systems in these parts of the world. The greatest threat to all of us comes from the attacks on diversity that are taking place in the centers of diversity of agriculture in Mesoamerica, in Ethiopia, in the Andes, in South Asia, in Southeast Asia and China, where in the Middle East, where these homelands of crop diversity are also under attack from the industrial food system, but they're also under attack especially from genetically modified crops, rice in Southeast Asia, because of golden rice and other GM rice varieties. also in Mesoamerica, of course, the development of GM maize encroaching on the center of diversity in Mexico and Guatemala.
Mm-hmm. And do you think also that the land grabbing phenomenon is contributing to a loss of biodiversity around the world?
I think it will. And probably, I'm sure to some degree it is anyways right now. A lot of the land grabs, of course, are taking place without much happening afterward. So that the land is still being left as it was. They simply they haven't done anything with the land in many cases. But the risk is certainly there that not only is a threat not just to genetic diversity, it's a threat to the peasants who would normally have access to that land. So it's a threat in that sense. I think that the wider threats come from the intellectual property policies that are increasingly forcing farmers to grow commercial varieties, and the pressure of GM crops, especially Terminator type crops, which may again come to haunt farmers and destroy more diversity.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Before talking more in detail about the international regulatory framework, I want to ask you, what is the Convention on Biological Diversity, CBD, and how does it function?
Well, the convention, of course, came out of the Rio Summit of 1992, and we actually were very much opposed to it. We felt that and still feel that in many ways it entrenched ideas such as intellectual property over genetic resources and genetic diversity, and created a space for patent regimes that wasn't there before. So we always felt that it was too hastily organized and agreed to by governments. It really said that everything that we know that has value in the world, all that, roughly 1/4 of the plant life of the planet, which has been identified and commercialized by private companies, belonged to those who have it at the time when they ratified the Biodiversity Convention. So that was a huge grab, the biggest grabs in 500 years since Columbus, over the commercial biodiversity. It meant that whatever the British had in Kew Gardens, whatever the Germans had in Berlin in their gardens and in the gene banks, whatever the United States had in its gene banks, was at least equally the property of those countries, even though it was taken initially from Brazil or Mexico or India or China or wherever. So it was a real loss for developing countries and for peasant peoples around the world when that treaty was signed. To be fair, since then, I would say the treaty has tried in many ways to protect biodiversity. It has done its best, I think, to draw attentions to biopiracy issues around the world. Not particularly successfully, but at least it's been a forum for debate over biopiracy. And it has at least been a place where we're able to call to attention the world's governments on the encroachment of other technologies such as synthetic biology, which are a very great threat to biodiversity. We were also, through the Biodiversity Convention, because it existed, we were able to get agreement to have a moratorium of all governments against Terminator technologies. That was established in the year 2000, and that moratorium is still in place. So even though we felt that the treaty was a mistake initially and too hastily negotiated, it has served here and there some useful purposes for as a form of debate, at least.